Ernesto arrived in Guatemala, where something new was happening. President Jacopo Arbenz, a progressivist military man, had promised a vast program of reforms. The most important idea was that of bringing to an end the existence of large estates and nationalizing the properties of United Fruit, a very powerful U.S. company. With the support of the Eisenhower administration, the local oligarchy was against the idea. Along the way, I had the chance to see the United Fruit properties. Once again, I was convinced of how terrible these capitalist octopuses are. I will improve myself and acquire what I need to become an authentic revolutionary. In December 1953, Ernesto settled in the capital and met several Cuban exiles who had taken refuge in Guatemala after a failed insurrection attempt led by Fidel Castro against the Batista regime. Led by a young Cuban lawyer, Fidel Castro, they tried to capture the Moncada barracks. The armed assault resulted in carnage, and their leader was captured and condemned to 15 years in prison. In remembrance of the Moncada assault, the group decided to call themselves the 26th of July movement. June 15, 1954. The Eisenhower administration gave the go-ahead to Operation Success. This was a CIA plan which financed the opposition to the government and trained a paramilitary force to invade the country. The situation precipitated in the space of a few weeks. Jacopo Arbenz resigned and left the country in the hands of a new military government loyal to American strategic interests. These were dangerous times for supporters of Arbenz's progressivist government. Ernesto decided to move to Mexico, where his life reached a turning point. While Cuba was rocked by the student protests against Batista's corrupt regime, Fidel Castro was unexpectedly freed from prison and immediately joined his companions in Mexico. July 7th, 1955, Mexico City. Meeting Cuban revolutionary Fidel Castro was a political event. An intelligent boy, he's very sure of himself and is extraordinarily courageous. I think there's mutual respect between us. When Ernesto met the volcanic Fidel, it was love at first sight. Castro was looking for a doctor to join the group of revolutionaries that would land in Cuba to overthrow dictator Batista. Guevara didn't think twice. He will carry out the revolution. We're in perfect harmony. Only for someone like him would I give all of myself. At that time, Ernesto was financially dependent on Hilda Gadea, a woman who belonged to the left wing of the Peruvian party, which was there in exile. Just after he met Fidel Castro, Hilda told Che that she was pregnant. He wrote in his diary that he would marry to keep her dignity. From the 15th of February 1956, I'm a father. My communist soul expands in an excessive manner. The baby girl came out just like Mao Zedong. At the moment she weighs less than Mao, but she will grow. At last, Castro found a boat to reach Cuba. The Granma was an old cabin cruiser. On board, there were 79 Cuban revolutionaries and 3 foreigners: globe-trotting Argentine doctor Ernesto Guevara, Dominican Ramon Mejias, also known as Pichirillo, and Italian Gino Donné, who was fleeing post-war unemployment. Everything was ready for departure. December 2nd, 1956. It wasn't a landing. It was a shipwreck. The 82 people who landed on the Cuban coastline were decimated by the initial skirmishes with the army. The dozen that survived hid in the Sierra Maestra, a massif 130 kilometers long and 50 kilometers wide. Up against a 4,000-strong modern army, the guerrillas established relationships with the campesinos, peasants, which progressively boosted their ranks. It was our baptism of fire, the beginning of the formation of what was to become the rebel army. Right during the shootout, I found myself in front of a rucksack full of medicine and a crate of ammunition. The weight stopped me from taking both. I took the crate of ammunition and left the rucksack. In battle, Ernesto Che Guevara found his missing part. He discovered he was unafraid of dying and played a fundamental role in the development and survival of the rebel army. One day, a spy among the rebel army was discovered. It was one of the peasants who had voluntarily joined up. The traitor was unmasked and condemned to death, but nobody was prepared to carry out the execution. Che volunteered himself and wrote about it in his diary, describing the size of the wound caused by the bullet and how the bullet entered and exited the man's brain. He wrote about how calmly he slept that night, without asthma attacks. Without any advance notice, Fidel named Ernesto commander. It was the highest military position in the rebel army. There's a bit of vanity inside every one of us. This appointment made me feel the most important man on earth. From that moment, Ernesto was known by everybody as Commander Guevara. With his men, Che installed a radio transmitter and the typography of a newspaper to spread the word about the actions and conquests of the rebel army. Radio Rebelde brought the voice of the revolutionaries to the whole island. The message was simple: freedom or death.
¡Libertad o muerte! Aquí Radio Rebelde, transmitiendo desde las montañas de Oriente, territorio libre de Cuba.